the first thing they need to do is speed up the process whereby we wean Europe of Russian oil and gas. Currently, it's promised that it will be complete by the 1st of January 2028, which is quite a long way away from it at the moment. So that needs to be brought forward.
The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, hosted the Coalition of the Willing in London today with a plan in place for how Ukraine's allies will support them until the end of 2025.
First, we will act to take Russian oil and gas off the global market. Last week, the UK became the first country to sanction all of Russia's oil majors. On Wednesday, the US acted decisively to join us, together with further sanctions from the EU. Second, we're determined to push on with the progress on Russia's sovereign assets and unlock billions to help finance Ukraine's defence. Third, we are strengthening Ukraine's air defence to protect its civilians and its energy infrastructure. I announced today that we're accelerating our UK programme to provide Ukraine with more than 5,000 lightweight multi-role missiles. Fourth, we will keep up the military pressure on Putin through the continued provision of long-range capabilities.
So as the Prime Minister earlier this afternoon at the Coalition of the Willing, well, over 20 nations supporting Ukraine have agreed to this in a bid to pressure Vladimir Putin to end the war. But does it go far enough? What else could they be doing? Let's talk to Col Simon Diggins, defence analyst. Hello, Simon.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you?
Very well indeed. Always good to be talking to you on a Friday at this time and reflecting on what was discussed and unveiled today. The Prime Minister talked very confidently and very boldly as though something new was being revealed. How new was it? How significant was it?
I think the honest answer is not much was new. I mean, some of the promises on, for example, unlocking the frozen Russian assets, providing defence, bolstering air defence, continuing to support Ukraine's bid for long-range missiles, those we've heard before. I think the optics of it in this particular instance is probably more important. There'd been a sort of slightly stalled exchange between President Zelensky and President Trump and President Putin, and the putative talks in Hungary that didn't happen, and then will they be given tomahawks, will they not be given tomahawks? And I think it probably left people a little bit confused about where support lay for Ukraine. So I think one of the most important things about this is the coalition of the willing getting together and saying, we still support you and we'll do everything we can to support you. But on specifics, on big changes, I'm a little bit more sceptical.
Yeah, and so is President Putin, because he looks at this group, the willing, and he clearly doesn't take them seriously. What more do they need to do in order for him to say, this is going too far, it's hurting too much, I need to read the room?
Well, the first thing they need to do is speed up the process whereby we wean Europe of Russian oil and gas. Currently, it's promised that it will be complete by the 1st of January 2028, which is quite a long way away from it at the moment. So that needs to be brought forward. The second thing, I think, is the assets. At the moment, there's been a sort of, again, slightly stalled debate about how they access the assets. Belgium says you need to cover our risks. We need to determine whether it's going to be taken as basically just taken off the Russians, or whether it's going to take the interest, or whether they're going to put it into bonds. I mean, there's very sort of complex financial instruments conversations running around at the moment as to how to do that. But they need to be concluded. And I think the Danish Prime Minister talked about it being concluded by Christmas Eve. And so that needs to happen. And then on things like the long-range missiles. So if America's not prepared to provide Tomahawk missiles, the alternative is probably Germany. Germany has a very capable missile called the Taurus missile, which again they've been reluctant to give to the Ukrainians. So I think what President Zelensky needs to hear, and more importantly, therefore, what Putin needs to hear, is not just this warm rhetoric, but these are the things that are going to happen. And they're going to happen in short order and by a very, very specific deadline.
Yeah.
And then I think he might respond.
You can see why the former US NATO ambassador, Kurt Volker, has coined this phrase, coalition of the waiting, i.e. these leaders are forever waiting on Donald Trump's next move. And in fact, I mean, it was slightly toe-curling, wasn't it, to hear every single one of those leaders being at pains to thank Mr. Trump for his leadership, for the new sanctions on Russia's major oil and gas producers. And I'm wondering, and perhaps other people are too, how much more could they do without waiting for Mr. Trump's initiative?
I think they could do a bit more. I think they're reluctant to do. I mean, what he said to the Europeans, though, is you expect us to to provide the bulk of the money to Ukraine. In fact, they don't. The European Union spends at least as much as America does. But to accept the risk, for example, on provision of the Tomahawks, and yet you're not doing enough yourself. So there's a sort of delicate sort of three-way balance going here. There's the war between Ukraine and Russia. There's the European allies who are supporting Ukraine, and you've got this sort of semi-engaged ally, the Americans, which, I mean, this is characterizing Biden's provision. It was the line was, $1 too little, 1 day too late.
Yeah.
Well, we've now got this sort of huge reluctance of Trump to go any further than that. He will go further, but he needs to know the Europeans are committed alongside him. And I think the concern is, and the fear is, again, despite the rhetoric, that every so often the Europeans expect us to be able to hide under Uncle Sam's umbrella yet again. And that is unacceptable to him. And also, I think, unacceptable to a lot of the American people. And I think that's the new reality. And every so often, even though you hear our leaders saying, yes, we recognise that, we need to do more ourselves, every so often, I think they're going to creep back under that umbrella and wait for the Americans to move first.
Yeah. And when Russia says it's concerned about its security, that's the fundamental issue it wants addressed, and it claims that has not been addressed. It wants these guarantees. Often Western analysts laugh it out of the room and say, you're being ludicrous. But I'm wondering, where can Russia's ideas about its own security and NATO's idea about Ukraine security meet in the middle?
I think we have to recognise with the Russians that their position is what you might call a maximalist view. You also have a view which is that they are a great power, and the great power needs to be protected. It needs to be strong in itself. It's got a close allies around it, which for them are the other bits of what they call the Great Russia Project, Belarus, and of course Ukraine. And then further out beyond that, there's another, if you like, ring of vassal states who will provide a sort of bulwark against aggression from there. So I don't think there's much of a direct position with them, trying to meet them. I think we can try and show that we're not aggressors, but we need to be very clear about why, for example, countries like Poland joined NATO. It's not because the West or the wicked West was pushing east against Russia. This is nonsense. They joined NATO because as a country, Poland and all the other countries had been serially invaded by Russia over centuries. And they worked out the only way they can protect themselves is by joining the only organization that was prepared to stand up to Russia. So I think we should be very careful about trying to find a sort of false compromise between a sort of maximalist state determined to take back as much of the power as it had before at the height of the Cold War, and Western European countries who have no territorial ambitions, have no interest in aggression towards Russia, are not interested in Russia's internal problems, except I want to do trade and business with them. Because I think if you try and find a false compromise between them, actually we end up in a very, very, very poor place.
Right. And then just thinking about the way the European leaders were paying tribute to President Trump today, it was a little bit like when you watch his cabinet meetings, in the White House, and every single one of them around the table says, and thanks to our great president, thanks to President Trump. What do you think Trump might want to do next, given that last week apparently he was throwing maps of Ukraine across the table from Zelensky, saying, I don't even know where these places are, I've had enough, just essentially yield and just give in. And then a few days later he was saying, okay, I'm ramping up these sanctions. A week or so ago he was talking about giving Tomahawks. What do you think is going to happen next?
Well, the first thing is he'll continue to be inconsistent. So he's going to be consistent in his inconsistency. I think that's the first thing to kind of recognise. I think with Trump, they always say that 90% of diplomacy is psychology. I think in terms of President Trump, it's probably 99% is psychology. So I think what he's after the whole time is kind of his big picture stuff. He likes the idea of peace. He likes the idea of being a peacemaker. So to some extent, you have to flatter that. And whether it be his cabinet around the table, or if you like the cabinets of European chancelleries flattering him and saying, that's what you want. We want to support your idea of getting peace in Europe, because peace is good business, is good for business, and that's where we need to go. And I think if you can keep him on that line, then you're likely to get some results and some forward movement. But he also responds to other people working. So if the Europeans can get their act together by Christmas and sort out how to use the frozen Russian assets, if Germany steps up and says, in the absence of Tomahawk, we're going to put Taurus on the ground and train the Ukrainians in how to use it, and other European countries do the same in terms of their defences, then I think you'll find President Trump coming behind them, going, "So yeah, you're serious about this. You're prepared to take risks. In that case, we're prepared to take risks as well, and then we'll put pressure on Putin." But it's a bit of a stately dance, Henry, at the moment, and it's very difficult to know who is going to put put their foot forward first. And I think that's the key to it at the moment.
Okay, Colonel Simon Diggins, defence analyst, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. You can respond to